Today, we are going to be discussing deductive arguments. When it comes to arguments, deduction is one of the most famous forms, mostly due to the popularity of the fictional character Sherlock Holmes. However, Sherlock for the most part used abductive reasoning and made abductive inferences, but that's a story for another day. Deduction, as we will soon see, is the strongest form of arguments we have. It is for this reason that most philosophers will tend to use deductive arguments whenever possible. Today, we are going to look at criteria for deductive argument. As I go through this lesson, every detail is important, and the conclusion of the video is possibly the most important part, so be sure to stick around. For the entire duration of the video, I want to help you so you can become a better thinker, interpret the Bible better, make well-reasoned arguments, and above all, love God with all your mind. And by the way, don't forget to hit that like button, as well as the subscribe button, and then click that bell to turn on notifications. Are you ready? Then let's get started. In order to differentiate deductive arguments from inductive arguments, we need to understand a critical difference between the two. Deductive arguments are non-ampliative. All that means is that the conclusion is not amplified beyond the premises. In other words, it doesn't go beyond the premises. The conclusion makes explicit what information is already implicitly contained inside the premises. So there is no gap between the premises and the conclusion. Let's look at an example argument to make sure that we understand this. Okay, premise 1, all men are mortal. Premise 2, Socrates is a man. Conclusion, therefore, Socrates is mortal. Notice what has happened here. We started by talking about all men and mentioned an attribute all men have, that of being mortal. Next, we singled out one of these men, Socrates, and in so doing, we can reach a simple conclusion that because all men have this attribute of being mortal, and Socrates is part of the group of all men, Socrates must also have this attribute. Notice also that if the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. In addition, the conclusion follows because of the repetition of the subject and predicate terms in the statement. This is why it is important to keep the same verbs going on in the statements as much as possible. Please don't worry if that doesn't make sense right now. I will explain and demonstrate exactly what I mean in future videos. For now, let's move on to the next part. Validity. If a deductive argument's conclusion follows from its premises by way of the rules of logic, then it is impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false. A deductive argument is either valid or invalid. Validity does not come in degrees. Validity is also not about truth or falsity. So when we say it is impossible for a valid argument to have true premises and a false conclusion, that is because it has not violated the rules of logic or committed an error in reasoning. Let's go ahead and look at an example. Premise 1. If it is raining outside, then the sidewalk will be wet. Premise 2. The sidewalk is wet. Conclusion, therefore it is raining outside. This argument commits the error of affirming the consequent. Notice that now we could easily argue the sidewalk might be wet for other reasons, like somebody washed their car or the sprinklers turned on. This is a formal fallacy of affirming the consequent, which simply put means that the argument is in the wrong form. One of the ways we can identify errors in a deductive argument is to know the correct forms of deductive arguments and to then learn tools like the square of opposition and other devices designed to help us spot formal errors. There are several, and we will discuss them in the future. Now on to truth. Truth does not come in degrees either. While somebody can be mostly dead, statements or propositions are not mostly true or false. Sometimes, truth can be confused with our degree of justification for the truth, and we may express that in terms of probability, and we'll talk about that when it comes to induction a little bit more to clarify. But for now, to quote Forsman from the Critical Thinking Toolkit, he says this to say, "Statements or propositions can only have one truth value, and it must only be either true or false. Moreover, statements or propositions can't be both true and false in the same sense under the same circumstances." Logicians call this the principle of bivalence, essentially. Now we can formally define that as bivalence, the purely semantic property dictating that any given proposition is either true or false. And that comes from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's article on contradiction, which you can find for free online. Now, the law of excluded middle, simply put, is the principle that any proposition must be either true or false. This is one of the fundamental laws of logic. In other words, statements or propositions can't be sort of true and sort of false. Programmers also deal with this in terms of Boolean expressions. If there was gray area in terms of truth, we could not have functioning computer programs, believe it or not. Our operating systems wouldn't work. It is worth mentioning there is something known as fuzzy logic, which does accept gray areas, but we're not going to be dealing with that right now. And to be honest, it's not something we need to worry about either. Now, once we have validity plus true premises, we have a sound argument. For a deductively sound argument, it needs to be free of errors, in other words, valid, plus have true premises, that equals sound. If it is sound, the conclusion must be true. Next, deductive premises may be supported by induction. For instance, in the Socratic argument, we come to know that all men are mortal by inductive reasoning. Keep in mind how we come to know something is not the same as how we argue for a conclusion. Do not confuse the support for a premise with the form of the argument. This is a mistake I see people make all the time. Remember this: if valid with true premises, that the conclusion of a deductive argument must be true. This is important. Okay, I want to talk for a minute about defeating arguments. If you have provided premises for a conclusion and justification for those premises, which I haven't really talked about yet, and the argument is sound, then it stands in the absence of a defeater. Period. Remember, if an argument is sound, the conclusion must be true. Some people try to claim that this statement is an argument from ignorance, but this misunderstands the fallacy of an argument from ignorance. An argument from ignorance commits an error when the sole evidence for the claim is that your opponent is incapable of disproving your claim, or the inverse. However, once you add evidence for the conclusion by way of the premises and provide justification for those, that's no longer the case. In other words, that's no longer your claim. Your reasons are what you provided as evidence by way of the premises, and you've met your burden of proof. Again, if it is sound, it must be true. It is now up to an opponent to show either the argument is invalid or the premises are false. To say you must still prove the argument after providing the argument itself is not only false, but fails to recognize that arguments are called proofs for a reason. The person demanding you still prove the argument is most likely attempting to get you to convince them psychologically, which is not your job to do. Now, for any Christian out there thinking that this statement that I'm making goes against what Greg Koukl is stating in his book called Tactics, I would encourage them to read or listen via an audiobook again. Greg is stating people need to provide evidence for a claim that is true. So when he states it's not his job to disprove their claim, but their job to prove it, it is because in his scenario they have not yet met their initial burden of proof. They haven't provided any evidence for the conclusion of the claim. So where does this leave us? Well, let's summarize some of these points first before concluding. 1. Deductive arguments are non-ampliative. The conclusion makes explicit what information is already implicitly contained in the premises. So there is no gap between the premises and the conclusion. Number 2, if a deductive argument's conclusion follows from its premises by way of the rules of logic, it is valid. Number 3, an argument has either true or false premises. Truth does not come in degrees. Number 4, validity plus true premises equals a sound argument. If the argument is sound, the conclusion must be true. Number 5, support for premises might be inductive, but that does not change the form of the argument. Number 6, it is not your job to psychologically convince the reader or listener of your deductively sound argument. If it is sound, the conclusion must be true. Wow, that was a lot of work. Well, be sure to rewatch it as you need to and hit that like button. Click the subscribe button and the bell to turn on notifications. And please, prayerfully consider donating if you love the videos so we can pay for all the books, advertising, web hosting, and other things that a ministry like this requires. So, until next time, we love you all and God bless.